Good afternoon, everyone. I hope everyone is having an enjoyable afternoon and has taken advantage of a lot of the great sessions that Black Health Matters has brought during this fall summit. I'm very excited to be here with you today. My name is Cassandra Smith, and I'm the Director of Diversity and Inclusion in Clinical Trials for Janssen, the pharmaceutical company of Johnson & Johnson. At Johnson & Johnson, we have a long history of tackling the most serious health diseases around the world. And at Janssen, the pharmaceutical division of Johnson & Johnson, we aim to bring these products to life that will ultimately help with communities becoming healthier and going through the disease with a product that could work for them. A critical piece to how we bring medicines to life is the clinical trial process. At Janssen, I'm responsible for making sure that our trials are representative and inclusive of people that actually have the burden of disease in real life. And we know that all populations don't participate in clinical research as much as others. This has really been brought to light during the current COVID-19 pandemic. So I have the honor and privilege of introducing this next session, which is going to talk all about clinical trials and give people a better understanding about what they are, why is it important to participate, and what role they play in bringing new drugs and new medicines to life. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Kevin Pruitt, the 7th District Health and Medical Initiative Chairman for Omega Psi Phi Fraternity Incorporated. Dr. Pruitt, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Ms. Smith. Thank you, everybody. Today, as she said, I'm just going to do a basic general synopsis of clinical trials. It's not all inclusive, but it should give you a basic understanding of the process of clinical trials. And thank you. And my first slide, if you can see it on the screen, you can see that clinical trials are necessary just because we need to find solutions to disease states. This is usually done through vaccines, new therapies, or new ways of using old therapies that we may have that just may not have known the new cure for something else. So we do these to just develop new drugs and to find out ways to satisfy human disease and make sure that they're safe and effective. What we know about clinical trials and what you need to know is it is regulated. The FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, has power over all the medications, biologicals, and medical devices that are currently out in the United States. That authority is also extended to the United States Department of Health and Human Services, which is oversight with the FDA as far as protecting citizens and making sure drugs and different devices are safe for our utilization here in America. The clinical trial process, as we get into more explanation, I will go through various forms and different things, but right now I need you just to understand one of the basic key ingredients before any clinical trial can start, and that's called our Institutional Review Board. Now, if you can look at the bold type, the Institutional Review Board, or the IBR as we said in clinical trials, is made up of members, mainly scientists, PhDs, doctors, MDs, and lay people. The lay people are the common people who interact between the doctors and the scientists to make sure that the average person is represented from a normal level, because we will be recruiting lay people to our clinical trials. So that's why that lay person is a critical person on that board. And what the IRB does, it approves clinical trials before they are submitted to the FDA. In other words, they make sure all the basic rights and different procedures are done and checked and accounted for before they submit them up to the FDA. And you can understand that because what it will do is save time for the FDA of regulating everything down at the microscopic level. So once again, you can see on there, on this new slide, the purpose of the IRB is basically to protect the rights and safety of the participants as it has to do with research. There are 5 different types of clinical trials. We have diagnostic clinical trials, so those would be things like clinical trials to say a blood pressure machine to make sure the blood pressure machine works and it really does take your blood pressure. We have quality of life trials. Does it improve people with chronic illnesses? Will this particular new invention help with your quality of life? We also have prevention trials. Right now we're in flu season, so influenza vaccine would have went through a prevention trial to try to prevent people from getting the flu. So that also goes through a clinical trial. We also have screening trials, which are used to detect disease. If you have a particular disease, we need a test that will work to diagnose that disease, I'm sorry, and screening trials are used for that purpose. And we also have treatment trials, and those are the ones that most everybody hears about. Treatment trials are the one where the patient actually gets some type of intervention in order to make them feel better or rid them of their particular disease. Should people participate in clinical trials? Yes, and people do it for different reasons. We have some volunteers that do it because they want to move science forward and help the general overall society. We have some people who join clinical trials because they may have disease and they might want to get in on the cutting line new cure or disease technology that's out there, and it might not be open to the market yet. So they may enter a clinical trial to receive that type of newest treatment. We also have people who get into it for financial compensations. Many clinical trials pay financial compensation for the time and effort of being in a clinical trial. And lastly, people also join clinical trials for finding a better way to treat others. It's kind of their gift to humanity. They want to see what they can do to help the general humanity with future treatments, even though they may not have an illness themselves. Compensation for clinical trials. Now, different clinical trials pay different amounts depending on the time and different things involved, but an average range can be somewhere between a $50 to $300 a day or per visit, depending on how the different clinical trials are set up. People often ask, are we protected in our clinical trials, or what laws are available? And if you see on the screen, October 5th, 2010, we've had laws on the books already, but the president signed into law in 2010, improving clinical trial access. And what that did is it encouraged people to join clinical trials. And if they are receiving financial compensation for those clinical trials, it allowed them to get their first $2,000 tax-free or excluded from taxability on that $2,000. So it was just a way to say that you can get a compensation without having to be taxed on that, in addition to our other laws that we already have on the books. If you see, the next thing that we do before you enter a clinical trial is informed consent. And what does informed consent mean? Informed consent is making sure that anything that's done, if you decide to enter a clinical trial, is your choice. It outlines everything is you. You have the autonomy to say yes, you have the autonomy to say no. You're supplied with the purpose, duration, procedures, risk, everything you see there in the bold print is provided to you. We also have the Health and Human Service Regulation, which is 45 CFR, which is another rig that we use during clinical trials. And there you see IRB, once again, there again, to make sure that the 45 CFR is followed before it's kicked up to the Health and Human Services and the FDA. And what these different laws do, these are federal regulation laws, and what these laws do is they make sure that your rights and you as a human are protected. And it's a safe keep for you to make sure that no risk or minimum risk, if any, will come to you if you do join a clinical trial. We have another slide here, and I just wanted to let you know, if you can look at the bottom, and that is the in addition to the 45, and it would be the 4616C sub 3. Now, I just spent a couple of minutes saying clinical trials pay most participants for joining. Now, this one is a little different. There are some clinical trials that you have to pay as a participant to join. And this is just that regulation letting you know that all clinical trials may not pay compensation, but you may actually have to pay to enter some clinical trials. And usually those are related to the clinical trials for rare diseases where a manufacturer, drug company, very few people have the disease. It's very expensive for them to put on a clinical trial, and they may have to charge a nominal fee in order to enter you into that clinical trial if you suffer from that disease state. And it's just a disclosure to letting you know that you actually pay instead of them paying you. One of the key things after informed consent is actually knowing your patient bill of rights. And as a participant, you have the right to be safe, considered, and treated with respect during your clinical trials. You have the right to have everything communicated to you, as said before, and that's permitted by law. You also have the right to know the physician's responsibility who will be coordinating your health during that clinical trial, and to receive complete information about diagnostic, treatment, and prognostic information from your physician who will be covering you, or your healthcare worker. Sometimes it may be a nurse. But you do have a right for any of that information, and that falls under the basic patient bill of rights. You also have the right to receive information necessary to your informed consent, which we went over, to any type of hospitalization that may be required, to advance appointments. Maybe it's follow-up sometime after clinical trial, and they may need you to come in and see a physician for X amount of visits after the clinical trial end. You have a right to know all that information ahead of time. Also, you have a right to treatment of pain, to refuse any type of treatment. As I mentioned, you have total autonomy in that. And if you're discharged, that it won't jeopardize your health, or your rights will still be protected under that until you are totally safe and discharged from the clinical trial care. And that all falls under the Bill of Rights, including transferring to a new facility, medical summary, and additional designation to physician or other organizations. Sometimes your care might be transferred to another physician. You have a right to know all of that under the Patient Bill of Rights. And this is readily available on the internet for anybody who needs to look that up and make sure all your different questions are answered. Let's go over some of the reasons in our community why people reject joining clinical trials. As Ms. Smith said, there are various reasons that we want people to join clinical trials, and here are some of the reasons that they don't. And I'm going to just read a few of them, and then we're going to expound on ways to overcome some of these problems in our community later in the lecture. But some people don't like being randomized into particular arms of the clinical trial. So what does that mean? There are usually, on average, 2 arms of the clinical trial. So there's the placebo, which means you don't receive medication, and then there's the medication arm of the clinical trial. And some people just want to receive the medicine, and they don't like if they are randomized to the placebo. So that's, a deterrent for some people. Some people don't like to adhere to a regimen because it is a clinical trial. Various data has to be collected, and some people might not like the scheduling, travel constraints, taking time off work, family commitments, the cost of travel, long periods of day, not being able to get off work, and various other things. Clinical trial. Now, everybody usually hears about the phases in the clinical trial on the news. However, I just wanted to mention there is a preclinical phase, which is basically the discovery phase of a medicine or a diagnostic product. And usually it's tested in animal models before it gets to the human phase. Just wanted everybody to be aware of that. And phase 1 is the start of the human phase. Now, sometimes we do or depending on the clinical trial, there is a such thing called a 0 phase. And that's usually when they just learn about pharmacokinetics in the human body before they move on to phase 1. Now, phase 1 is usually, if you look at the screen, you'll see that's young, healthy people. They don't necessarily have the disease, but we want to just test the new discovered compound from the preclinical phase in healthy patients. Usually it's around 50 people. And basically that is just to determine the dosing regimen and safety. How much do we give? What is the toxic dose? How much don't we give? And is it safe for human consumption? Usually about 70% of drugs that move into phase 1 clinical trial move on to phase 2. And in phase 2, we test it in the people who actually have the disease. So let me give you an example. If I'm testing a blood pressure medication that I just finished in phase 1, I tested phase 1 in healthy people who don't have high blood pressure. I moved to phase 2. Now I test it in a larger population, usually up to 500 people or participants or people in the clinical trial. But I'm going to test that in people with hypertension or high blood pressure. And that we're trying to determine, is it effective? Is it safe? Does it work, basically, in a nutshell? Does it work? And what are the side effects? And once we get to phase 2, probably around 30–35% move to phase 3. And in phase 3, we have people affected with the disease. So now I move it up to an even larger pool of people. If we keep with our same example, hypertension, even more people with hypertension move to phase 3. And once again, in phase 3, I'm comparing phase 3 to other hypertension medicines that are on the market. I'm just doing it comparable. I want to also look for safety, efficacy, and those same things from phase 2. But I want to make sure that when I move up to phase 3 or in phase 3, I want to make sure it works at least as well as other things that are on the market, so that I can compare and move on to the phase 4 phase. And usually the phase 3, we usually get about 25% of the drugs that move on from phase 3. Once they've been FDA approved after phase 3, the FDA would have to approve. It would be a new drug application, or a new drug application is usually what we use, and that moves to phase 4. Now, phase 4 is sometimes called post-marketing, or after approval. Sometimes they use various terms. And in phase 4, you put it on the market and they continue. You're not done. They continue to monitor to make sure that the drug doesn't have some untoward side effects that we didn't catch during phase 1, 2, and 3. So it's really post-marketing monitoring, if you want to say it, for lack of a better term. And we test that in various groups and various large populations, up to thousands and thousands of people after it's been approved for phase 4. Diversity in clinical trials. Very important that drugs are tested in a wide variety of different ages, races, ethnic groups, and genders. People ask why. Because we now know in medicine that different ethnicities, different races, and different gender are affected differently by different medications. Everybody doesn't respond to medication the same way. Everybody doesn't respond to, every racial group doesn't respond to medication in the same way as another. And we now know that, and we want to include everybody so that we can catch all things, blanket or a net over all aspects of our medication that we're putting on the market, to make sure that all are inclusive. And the Food and Drug Administration, as I said, will be in charge of asking those questions. You can see here is Section 907 of the FDA that regulates sex, age, race, and ethnicity as inclusive. If you looked at down at the lower part of the slide, you'll see 1 and 2. They're going to ask the question: are all included in your clinical trial? Sex, age, race, ethnicity. Are subgroups specific safety and effectiveness data in those subgroups. So before, if you go back 50 years in a clinical trial, they wouldn't ask. It would be very little ethnicity and different races in a clinical trial. Now you're expected to have that. Matter of fact, they're going to ask for that type of data. Diversity in clinical trials. As we spoke about earlier, Mrs. Smith was talking from pharmaceutical company. We tend to be lower as African Americans in entering clinical trials. And some of the people ask, well, why? Various reasons, but I'm just going to hit on a couple. The minority community relationship with the medical and scientific world has largely been built on a little bit of medical mistrust. And people say, well, what is medical mistrust? Well, past scientific community violations and transgressions against minority communities, specifically, everybody's probably heard of the Tuskegee experiment or sterilization programs, have made the Black community and other minority communities a little leery of joining in clinical trials, partly because they were enrolled in trials that they didn't know they were in, and their autonomy was taken. They didn't sign informed consent, and their Bill of Rights, as we went over earlier, weren't enforced. And so that has caused a little bit of wedge between the minority enrollment in clinical trials that has caused us to lag a little bit behind the rest of society. How can we increase minority enrollment in clinical trials? How can we overcome medical mistrust, as it's labeled? Well, here are a couple of methods to increase enrollment in our clinical trials. We're going to ask a lot of the drug companies and a lot of scientific companies to engage and target our community around recruitment into your clinical trials. Maybe putting up an advertisement on the internet may not be enough. You may have to send a representative down into the community to actually engage the community and make them feel more comfortable. Bring the community in early to the table. Let the community be a voice in spearheading some of those clinical trials and being a voice for their community. I know the layperson on the IBR committee would be one such person to probably help pull some of those community people in from our community to give us a better representation. Also, some of the larger clinical trials and studies that are not inside our community probably need to hear our concerns. Past transgressions against the Black community, as I said, have caused us to have a little bit of apprehensiveness. So that needs to be understood by some of the drug companies and cuddled a little bit, and so that they understand why we tend to not want to enter clinical trials at the same level as the rest of society. Of course, Black community, the church. Enough said, that is the pillar of the community. That would be a probably good base for some of the medical companies to reach out to and engage in the Black community. Also partner with minority medical groups. We have various Black doctor groups. Bottom line, people feel more comfortable when they see somebody in charge that looks like them. And by reaching out to minority medical groups, maybe we can have more, African-American doctors or minority doctors reach out to the groups and explain things to our community a little better that makes them feel more comfortable joining clinical trials. Information, educational opportunities are also another way to engage in a safe environment, which is usually our community. Community outreach groups. We have various community outreach groups in our community. That might be a place to recruit people and get information to them and let them be exposed so that they know people that they can trust are the face of their clinical trial endeavor. Engage the younger generation. And I bring up to engage the younger generation for a purpose. I've done research on medical mistrust, and what I found in my research, published published research that I've done is the younger generation grew up in a different time than the older generation. The older generation definitely doesn't trust the medical community to the same degree that the younger generation. Phase one, trials where I say young healthy people, that might be somewhere that we can get young people to get into that, because they have less medical mistrust because they weren't around during some of the times of the Tuskegee experiment and different things. So they're a little bit more trusting, and that might be an entry point, and maybe even a point to talk to grandma or parent to say, hey, I just did a clinical trial. I was fine, everything was good, maybe you should come down. So we need our younger generation probably to reach back. Also, our historically Black fraternities and sororities. We're service organizations, but we also are looking for ways to engage our community and bridge parents, grandparents, and the Black community. And we have an awful lot of resources that we can use, and probably recruiting to clinical trials is one such method. Methods for keeping Black people enrolled. And I bring this up because we do have some African Americans or minority people who join clinical trials, but joining is not always enough if they don't finish and stay enrolled. And so one of the things we need to do is stop or minimize the dropout rate and keep them engaged. And one of the things we talk about is the scheduling was a big problem. Barriers to healthcare, transportation, and different things that affect our community that may make us have a disproportionate washout rate once we do enroll. So we do need to enroll, but we also need to stay enrolled, because the ending of the clinical trial is the actual data that we need to sustain any conclusion. Another typical way that we do is we look at drug companies, and drug companies usually use certain trial sites, and they tend to use them over and over again. And sometimes those may not always be convenient for minority communities. If someone has to drive 45 minutes out of their way, one way to get to a clinical trial and 45 minutes back, they may be less apt to join another one, especially if they're going to do all their clinical trials at that one site. And they might not want to stay because the hassle and the time and travel may be too much for them. So just establishing maybe medical clinical sites around different minority-based areas, inner cities, so to speak. Why do minorities need to be included? And as I'm wrapping up, I just want everybody to know there's a lot of disease states that are being trialed right now that we need to be in. One of them is they're looking at an HIV vaccine. We know it affects our community disproportionately, and these are things that we need to include ourselves in so that we make sure that we're at the front of getting treatment when we need it. And so I bring that up just to let you know that this is important for our community, because a lot of these disease states affect our community. We also have another trial that's going on where they found the BCG vaccine, which it uses to vaccinate people to prevent them from getting TB. But one of the things they found out that it helps people secrete insulin. Now this is very, very good sign. And the reason is because this may be some type of key to help diabetics in our community, especially type 1, which is very, very prevalent, and type 2. So this is a study that's done at Massachusetts General Hospital. And this is something else at the forefront because we do suffer from diabetes. And of course, COVID-19, probably 20 to 30 different studies going on right now. If you've been following the news for the last 8 months, you know it's hitting our community and the Hispanic community disproportionately hard. We need to get into those clinical trials so that we can make sure that we have the necessary data to make sure that we're safe, and to make sure that people in our community are going to be receiving those different vaccines when they come out. And that's going to be necessary for us to join. I thank you for listening to me, and I'll do any questions at this time. I'll check to see if there's any questions going here. And if there's any questions, I would be happy to take them. I know we have a few minutes left. And I'm looking at the chat box. I don't see here. Here's some here. African Americans participating in COVID-19 trials. Yes, I'll type that answer. Yes, we need to join the clinical trials. What typically happens if we don't join, we won't have any data, and then we're usually the last to get it. We need to know. It's better for a vaccine for us to join into a clinical trial and find out how it affects a small percentage of African Americans before they put it out, and a large amount get it, and it doesn't work for us. So we need to find out that now. How do you encourage pharmaceuticals companies to do more clinical trial in pediatrics? Pediatrics is a harder sell, only because they're kind of a vulnerable population, pediatric and pregnant women, so forth and so on. That one is going to be more to the parents willing to enter their child into a clinical trial. So clinical trial for pediatrics is much more difficult. It involves a few more layers because the person who's actually going to be in the clinical trial can't speak for themselves. So you actually have the parent speaking for them. So it's a little bit more tricky, but I know pharmaceutical companies are trying to enroll pediatric patients as much as they can. Understanding the Bill of Rights and also remembering the inequality of medicine and people of color, can we truly trust clinical trials? As I said in my lecture, if we go through organizations where people look like us and we actually adhere to our Bill of Rights and know our Bill of Rights and we know the law, and if we feel like this being violated, we have people that we can call to report if we feel like we're being violated. So we have a lot more power now than we did, say, when the Tuskegee experiment was there and we didn't really have much rights. They just basically put people in a study and let it happen. So we're a lot more protected by that now. And so for that reason, we have a lot more options. Let's see, how can we find out clinical trials are being conducted? It depends on, clinical trials are always being conducted. Let me say that. Clinical trials are always being conducted. It depends on what you're looking for. If you're looking for something for cancer, if you're looking for something with hypertension, you can go on the FDA website and they usually have a link to get you to massive clinical trials, or you can Google a particular disease state and then they usually can point you in the right direction to whatever clinical trial you're looking for. And a lot of questions, but I know my time is up. What does covert really mean? Oh, covert just means coronavirus. It just means coronavirus. Basically, it's just a genre of a virus that affects human population that jumped from the animal population into the human species. So it's just a crossover virus. I believe they said, you know, they got it from some animals that crossed over to the human genotype. And I think that's my time. I'll try to type some more answers while the next person gets ready to come on so that I don't take up their time. But thank you everybody for having me. Once again, my name's Dr. Kevin Pruitt, Omega Psi Phi Fraternity. I want to thank Black Health Matters for having us on and allowing us to educate you today. And hopefully I answered some of your questions and handled some of your concerns.